It's no secret that the West is angry with Russia on a whole range of issues, but the feeling here in Moscow is decidedly mutual. My guest this week is Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergey Ryabkov. What are the chances of halting this current slide in East-West relations, or is there worse to come? Sergey Ryabkov, welcome to Conflict Zone. The Russian government condemned in the strongest possible terms the combined Western attacks, the recent Western attacks on Syria. But your foreign ministry spokesperson said something else as well. She said smart missiles should be directed at terrorists, not against a legitimate government. What exactly is legitimate about the Syrian government that gasses, tortures and murders its own people?
I do think that you will agree with me that President Assad and his government are elected by their people. The history of their struggle against terrorism is quite tragic, and we don't even know how the situation would unfold in terms of if it would be possible to preserve Syria as an integral country.
So you have, say, for instance, a politician here who's elected. He murders and tortures people. You continue to confer legitimacy on him? I find that hard to believe, Minister.
I didn't manage to answer a question, sir, yet. I will do it now. And that is, we don't have any evidence whatsoever that President Assad and his troops and his forces have done anything of what you have told us, or what the collective West has done.
Really? You haven't read the UN reports, for instance, from the Office of the High Commissioner? That doesn't impress you?
We did read everything. We have a number of issues to criticize these reports in terms of work of the so-called joint investigative mechanism, which the Western countries killed last year because they didn't want to change anything in its modus operandi.
They claim you killed it.
Yes, and we claim they did so. And you just go into our endless gigabytes of explanations that no one cares about. Everyone in the West tends only to hear himself or herself and disregard what the alternative view is. This is one of the most problematic trends in the overall development of so-called Western democracies. There could be no such thing as a democratic international order if people don't want to hear an alternative view.
So you dismiss everything that the UN's chief human rights official has said about President Assad. He called for Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court last month. He said the government was guilty of massive human rights violations. And in February 2016, a report from his office said the Syrian government had committed the crimes against humanity of extermination, murder, rape, torture and enforced disappearances, among others. But you dismiss all that, Minister, and I'm curious as to why. They got it all wrong, they don't know what they're talking about?
Look, we saw in recent years a very troubling development where what was supposed to be a universal international tool that should, enforce order and move forward agendas that are based on good faith and compromise, quest for compromise. All this has been, developed into the tools of geopolitical games played by the group of Western countries, led currently by the US, by the United Kingdom, by France, who simply don't want to hear anything but their own views.
But I'm talking about the UN reports,
yes,
Minister.
Indeed,
the UN reports,
indeed.
They're not compiled by the USA,
no.
Britain and France, and yet you dismiss them out of hand as well.
We don't dismiss anything. We spend hours and days to explain why those conclusions and those contents of these reports are wrong in many ways.
If you have so little regard for the reports of the United Nations, why bother with the United Nations? Why bother with the human rights mechanisms when they get it so disastrously wrong in your view? Why bother?
We use the platforms which are there. We don't have alternatives to it. We constantly present our points at all committees of relevance in New York and Geneva. The Human Rights Council is one of those, and we will tirelessly and endlessly work towards correcting what is a very biased and politicized approach.
Why should it be biased and politicized by the United Nations? Why should it be?
Because
you think they just sit around and make these accusations up?
No, I think they are just so dependent on the so-called strong guys around who in turn don't believe in anything but their own views.
I thought you were one of the strong guys around in the United Nations. You're one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. You're one of the strong guys who uses your veto consistently to protect the Assad regime.
We use our veto consistently and will do so also in future to protect international order as set forth in the UN Charter, to protect international law, which is so blatantly being breached by the US, UK, France and many others who don't care about anything but their alliances and their, shared values.
And they say the same about your protection of Assad. I'd like perhaps you to answer the question, if you would, that Donald Trump put to Russia. What kind of nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women and children? Can you answer that? Why does Russia wish to be associated with a country that does those things?
Firstly, I don't believe any politician in the US is in his or her right to put this type of questions to anyone else after what was done by the US over years along the lines as just described without any explanation.
That's playing the what about game. What about the US? But I'm asking about this specific instance.
Well, we do think that the government in Damascus is a legitimate one which continues its fight against terrorism and protects its people from scourge of geopolitical engineering that is being played, introduced and pursued by the very same people who now try to accuse Damascus and Moscow in all sorts of mistakes and sins. That's very wrong. I think also it's very enlightening to see how popular it's been for a while already for people in the US and elsewhere to talk on who is on the right or who is on the wrong side of history.
I come back to
as if the US itself is history.
You support the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons?
We do, and we're one of the most responsible and active parties to the convention, and thus we support this organization. We think it's a well-deserved Nobel Prize that this organization received in 2013 for very collegial and cooperative effort to disarm Syria in terms of removal of its chemical arsenal completely, under very strong international involvement and very precise and thorough international control.
Well, let's talk about that, because you have misrepresented the statements of the OPCW on Syria, and I'll give you an example.
All right.
Let's go back to last year. Khan Sheikhun.
Right.
In April, Washington had accused Syria of using chemical weapons in Khan Sheikhun and retaliated against a Syrian airbase. All right. Your ministry rejected those claims because it said, on August the 22nd, the relevant international organization, in this case, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, confirmed that Syria's chemical weapons were completely destroyed under international supervision.
Right.
Only that wasn't what they said, was it? What the OPCW said was something different. They said Syria's declared stockpile had been destroyed. Declared.
Indeed.
Not the whole thing, but the declared stockpile.
Great.
And just a month before you made that statement, Director General Ahmed Uzumcu had voiced serious doubts about whether Syria had got rid of its weapons. Serious doubts. You're nodding your head. You knew that.
I can tell you the whole story.
You knew,
if you allow me.
You knew that there was serious
I'll tell you the whole
doubts.
story. I was part of it. I literally was part of it from the very beginning, from the day one, when President Putin offered to, at that time, President Obama, while in St. Petersburg, not to resort to military power, but start chemical disarmament in Syria. And every single day, Since that September day in St. Petersburg, I am involved into it. So
I understand, Minister, but you pretended that the OPCW had given Syria a clean bill of health, when it was in fact anything but clean. And the OPCW makes that point to this day. They made it again last month. They still haven't had satisfactory answers from Syria on a number of outstanding questions.
well, do you want me to respond to your question, or do you want to somehow look into a broader picture of it?
I'd love you to answer the question.
Right. So the answer is the declared chemical arsenal was completely destroyed under stringent international control with very material involvement of a number of countries, Russia included, US included, and so on and so forth. Subsequently, in some time, the OPCW and the technical secretariat of the organization started to introduce additional questions and or points which Syria was supposed to answer in terms of what they were doing in the research center in Barza. How about a number of facilities which were empty by that time in terms of hangars and tunnels and so on and so forth? And what about a number of munitions that were unaccounted for? The Syrian side, the Syrian government produced a number of explanations and invited...
Which were found to be unsatisfactory.
Well...
by the OPCW, and they wrote that. They said it again last month.
Right. Only to see then the US and others to rocket and bomb down what were supposed to be these facilities with no presence of anything in relation to chemical weapons whatsoever. So it's, you know...
But I thought you respected the OPCW.
An abnormal way to avoid and escape hard talk, the place where it belongs, at the platforms which were established exactly for that purpose, instead of continuing the political process and moving further forward to finalize the whole file and clean up the bill, so to say. The OPCW kind of looked away, looked apart from it.
I thought you respected them. You told me a moment ago you respected them. Now you're saying they're looking away.
Right.
Could it be that you only accept the verdicts of the OPCW when they accord with your views, and you're not prepared to listen to their other views?
Could it be that they don't listen to our views or the views of others when we make the right points and remind them on how the convention should be followed, if we are also attached to the legitimate legal part of our own behavior? Now I'm talking on everyone who is member of this convention. So we completely respect the OPCW. We think it's highly technical organization. Now it's more worrying because it's now being as High Commissioner on Human Rights at the UN, as many others, as Council on Human Rights.
They're all against you,
begin to look like a victim of very, very cheap and nasty political games of some within NATO, but also beyond NATO.
Minister, you keep calling for facts. Russia
Yes.
keeps calling for
Right.
facts. But when you get them, and you don't like them, you dismiss them.
Where are those
Standard
facts? Where are
technique.
those
The facts given by the OPCW, for instance.
For example.
Let's talk about Khan Sheikhoun.
Okay.
The experts at OPCW had major concerns about Khan Sheikhoun, didn't they? The alleged use of sarin on April the 4th, 2017, the event for which the Americans retaliated. Let's recall that your defense ministry offered at the time what it called objective data in an effort to prove that rebels had been to blame, a scenario that was comprehensively rejected by the UN and the OPCW investigators. They had no doubts about Syrian government culpability. They said in 2017, October, the leadership panel is confident that the Syrian Arab Republic is responsible for the release of sarin at Khan Sheikhoun. Their facts, based on their knowledge, their expertise.
Based on something that is being used more and more in terms of a so-called distance investigation. miles and dozens of miles away from the very place of incident, through the dissemination of some staged shooting produced by so-called white helmets and others who completely are playing into the hands of terrorists without any observation of the chain of custody of hard evidence, without any attempt to even visit Shayrat Air Base, from where allegedly the airplane which dropped the bomb with alleged Zarin flew away. They never went there. They never visited anything like this. And now they try to make the very same trick in Duma. Fortunately, we've been able to persuade Director General Usumcu and the Security Department of the UN Secretariat to let them go there and look for their own what happened.
After delaying them?
No, we didn't delay anything. I follow this hourly. I know that at every moment they were looking for green light, for clearance from the UN Secretariat, from the Department on Diplomatic, or what is being called security in New York.
But first
And
there
that
were
was the only
security
reason.
problems, we were told. Then there were problems with their documents, and the press was allowed in. The press was allowed in.
Well, I'm not aware of any problems with the documents. The Syrian government and the Russian military police were ready to let them in from the very first day, even before the strikes happened. Nonetheless, 3 or 4 days more were spent in an idle position, first in Beirut and subsequently in Damascus, without any attempt to enter Duma, for all sorts of reasons. Well, we will never agree on this, because all this about political games, and we perceive this way,
Well, let's
and we
not talk.
call this way.
Let's not talk about a game. Let's talk about what your Russia's defense spokesman, Igor Konashenkov, said on April the 13th. He said on television that Moscow had evidence that the UK was involved in organizing the event in Duma.
Right.
We have evidence that proves Britain was directly involved in organizing this provocation, he said.
Right.
What evidence, Minister?
A number of NGOs who cooperate very actively with the government of Great Britain produce...
How many
this-
NGOs?
At least 3 of them, starting with White Helmets and some others, including so-called Syrian Human Rights Observatory based in London. Those people are masters of producing falsifications in terms of shooting of something that didn't happen.
This is
In
evidence
terms of
that Britain. This is evidence that Britain created a fake.
No, not
This
at
is
all.
what you said. We have evidence
But
that
you
proves
know,
Britain was
the-
directly involved.
The British officials are using all this as the basis for the military attack, as do the others.
That's not quite the same thing that your spokesman said, is it? It's that you said we have
It's
evidence
exactly the
that
very
proves
same
Britain
thing.
was directly involved in organizing this provocation. How did it organize, Minister?
Why do you believe that something happened in Duma? Why do you think something at all was there? And it was not something that was developed in computers of those people with the involvement of the British
That
officials.
question is not evidence, is it, Minister?
We haven't seen any evidence on your part either, on the opposite.
You just throw these things out there that we have evidence that Britain was involved in organizing this provocation,
do have.
but
I
you
confirm
don't
what
have.
Konashenkov said.
But you don't have one scrap of evidence that you're prepared to give me.
We believe that there is no credible alternative explanation but the involvement of the British government. It's highly likely that the British government is involved into it.
Highly likely.
Indeed.
And that's your evidence, okay? But we've seen, you've put forward irrefutable evidence before, haven't you? Like last November when your defense ministry said it had irrefutable evidence of cooperation between US forces and Islamic State militants. And it attached photographs, apparently, to prove its point. But these photographs were completely different from what they were billed as. A fact spotted by a group of Russian internet investigators. None of the 5 photos attached to your defense ministry's posting was what they had claimed them to be, had they?
Well, I would be eagerly ready to look into these photos once again and discuss those with our people at the Ministry of Defense. I do think that what people at the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation are producing when they are talking on situations is, number one, completely credible, number two, based on facts and not on empty accusations which are pouring on us from all sorts of sources, and number three, we do so in thorough coordination between governmental agencies here in Moscow. So it's not without clearance and knowledge of everyone involved that such things are being put forward and disseminated on the part of Russian officials.
They blamed a civilian employee and deleted their tweets on the subject. Perhaps we should also take comments about the poisoning of Sergey and Yulia Skripal in England, also with a pinch of salt. You've produced an extraordinary array of counter-accusations against Britain. Perhaps Britain poisoned the Skripals, perhaps it had abducted them, perhaps it was holding them against their will. A coordinated and well-planned campaign, your ambassador at the UN said, with the aim of discrediting and even delegitimizing Russia. Do you really think that Britain hasn't got better things to do with its time?
I don't know. That's the question to the British side. By the way, they don't answer any of the questions which we produce and furnish to them formally through diplomatic notes without resorting to any microphones, dozens and dozens of those. They count for so-called scenarios that they believe Russian government disseminates. They started with 18, then they went up to 21. Subsequently, they talked here in Moscow on 30. Now they are down to 24. We endlessly count how many explanations of what has happened with Sergei Skripal and his daughter is being produced from different sources in Great Britain. But
some sources also from Russia as well. Some sources
Indeed.
also from Russia. Even
Indeed.
one of your two ex-Soviet
Mirzayanov, Ring, Ugliev, many others.
who worked on the Soviet chemical program in
He did,
Shikhani,
he did.
said he was convinced the Skripals
Right.
were attacked with a compound that he had helped to develop.
Indeed, indeed. But that doesn't mean that anything like this happened after the conclusion of the convention and after Russia became party to this convention.
No, he said that a similar poison had been used in the murder of a Russian businessman, Ivan Kivalidi, in 1995.
I will call you to look into what has been opened up in terms of documents and files and minutes of this process by the Russian Prosecutor General a couple of days ago.
Indeed,
There are
documents were
so
handed to the British.
so many interesting parts of that story that has been revealed. But coming back to those people who worked in Shikhani and elsewhere, you must remember that all these people were removed from the Russian Federation after the dissolution, after the demise of the Soviet Union, with the help of the Western governments. And subsequently, they made public all the formulas in relation to so-called Novichok family, to use the word, the title of this substance introduced by the British.
And confirmed by the OPCW.
It was never confirmed by OPCW. We are right now, these hours, talking at OPCW on the failed attempt of the British government to use OPCW as a tool against Russia, because no confirmation is given in this final report, even in its confidential version.
We haven't seen the final confidential report.
You haven't.
The OPCW said it confirmed the British position.
No, not at all. It only confirmed.
That's changed, has it?
No, from the very beginning, from the outset, that they only confirmed a formula of this substance,
right. They confirmed.
but with no attribution to from where it comes from. At least 15 to 20 countries around do have capabilities to produce these things. The British, to conclude that something like this was used against Sergei and Yulia Skripal, must have an etalon, a reference sample, which no one but themselves would develop and synthesize. So it's an open secret. We reject the accusation that there is no credible explanation but Russia.
I understand you reject, and you've rejected all the points that I've raised, which the West has raised. Where is this relationship going? How do you find some common ground between East and West? I ask you if you could be very brief because we're running out of time.
Right.
Or are things going to get worse?
I think my personal, well, in Russia, the foreign policy is being guided by the presidential decisions. We only introduce this in practice. My personal view is that a dual-track approach to the West is needed on part of Russia. That is deterrence/dialogue on issues which are interesting for Russia. And it should be based on strategic patience. Over time, when people recognize how wrong they were in all their failed attempts to change Russia, they may move to a better understanding of the new world.
All right, Sergey Ryabkov, thanks very much for being on Conference Zone.